working with the Russian Commission with the implications of addictions to society, and she's also working on a global level. She does year-long training groups in the US and in Europe. Her next major work will be a book, Beyond Science, Beyond Therapy, describing what is going on in individuals, families, organizations, and society. And she's finally coming out of the closet about her actual work. And she also lives what she talks about. And here's Ann Wilson Schaef this morning. Thank you.
Well, that introduction was close to what we said. We sort of found ourselves without an introducer this morning, so thanks for filling in. This morning, I just want to spend some time. Can I have the house lights up just a little bit? Thank you. I just want to spend some time trying to lead into the work that I've been doing and the perceptions that I think are important in understanding what's going on many levels in our society, and how I think that those of us who work with people who are in the helping professions need to stop and take a look at our training, what we've been doing, what we are doing, and I think where we need to go. I believe that we're at a time in our development, those of us in the helping professions, where we have an opportunity to move into a new paradigm, where we have an opportunity to take a look at our training, see how it's helped us to reach this point, and hopefully have the courage to move beyond what most of us have been taught to do. I think the new awareness of addiction is very key in moving us beyond where we've been and where we need to go. Some of you may be familiar with my writings. I think it's absolutely important that we begin to look at the levels of addiction in society. I have found that in the helping professions, there is a willingness to look at addictions on the individual and on the family level. And what I've found is that most people want to stop there. In fact, I've found they get quite brutal about wanting to stop there. And I think that's just the beginning, that we need to look at addiction in the individual. We need to look at addiction in the family. There's no question about that. We also need to look at addiction in our organizations, in the places where we spend the majority of our waking hours, many of us. Many of those organizations are crazy. And I'm finding a very interesting phenomenon as I travel around the country. I'm finding that more and more individuals are involved in recovery. And as a result of that, their families are actively involved in recovery. And then what they're saying to me is, my sobriety is being threatened by the place where I work. I'm not sure I can continue to be sober and work where I work. So two interesting things are happening. One is that people are leaving sick, addictive organizations. I'm sure many of you have. That's in some ways what AHP is all about. And are starting their own entrepreneurial efforts of one kind or another. The other thing that's happening is that addictive organizations are firing people who start to get healthy. That organizations can only tolerate people who are willing to function on the same level of pathology that they function. And that if people start to get better in the organizations, The organization cannot tolerate that. So what we're seeing at an organizational level is organizations, first of all, in their personnel and screening and interview procedures, filtering out people, not hiring people who are healthier than the lowest level of functioning of the organization. And secondly, we are seeing organizations get rid of people who threaten the level of illness of the organization. And so what is happening in the organization is that they are getting rid of the very people who might help the organization move to a different level of functioning and maintaining a level of disease. Now let me just say something about this addictive disease, because I think it's very important to understand these addictive diseases. I was trained in clinical psychology. I had good credentials. I went to an APA-approved program. I did my internship in an APA-approved hospital. I interned at Bellevue in New York under Dr. David Wexler. I worked in state mental hospitals. I wonder why they're called that. I never thought about that before. And I worked in mental health clinics. I worked for the Illinois Department of Mental Health. I worked as a school psychologist. One of the things that I discovered as I worked for many of these institutions was that the word mental health, or the term mental health, was a misnomer, that nobody was. The patients, the staff, the administration, there wasn't a lot of mental health. At one point when I was working for the Illinois Department of Mental Health, the hospital I worked for I just went crazy working there. So I decided to work in community mental health, and I really enjoyed that. I got in my state-owned vehicle and spent a lot of time wandering around in the Tules in Illinois and sitting on the whittler's bench and talking to the old men, and discovered an amazing amount of awareness about mental health out in the farms, a lot more than we knew. And I'd sit and talk to these guys and say, well, so-and-so, he's going to come out of the hospital next week. And they said, yeah, he was really crazy, wasn't he? I said, yeah. And then I'd say, well, we'd really like to have some community plan for this kid when he comes out of the hospital. They said, well, he's like that other boy that used to be here in the community. I said, well, what'd you do with him? Well, we all kind of kept an eye on him. Everybody knew he wasn't right, and we all kind of kept an eye on him. I said, well, you think the community's willing to do that now? Yeah, we'll probably do that. We don't need to organize it, but we can all keep an eye on him, and everybody knows where he is and what he's doing all the time. I thought, no, there's some real wisdom out here, But I had to go to staff meetings at the central office of the regional. They're called regional staff meetings. And I found those beyond boring and sometimes just plain awful. And one of the things that I did to survive Regional 7 staff meetings was I bought myself a girdle. This was back in the days of girdles, and I was sure I needed one, although as I look back I was slim as a rail, but compared to now. But I was just sure that I needed that little extra control. So I bought myself a girdle that was black, fuchsia, pea green, and I think it was orange. It was back at the time of colored girdles. And I would sit in those meetings, and the way I survived them, I'd sit there and I would think, nobody knows that I have this black, pea green, fuchsia girdle on. that's how I got through the meetings. And finally, my body, which is, I found that when I don't pay attention and listen to what's going on with me, my body usually gives me initially some subtle cues, and then if I haven't paid attention, I get some less than subtle cues. And I developed a fissure in my lower colon. Well, the day I had that diagnosed, I went home and I thought about that. I thought, a fissure in my lower colon. What is the symbolic meaning of this? I was really into symbolism at the time. And I thought, well, that means that I'm letting the shit out into my system. And I resigned the next day. Because it became really clear to me that it wasn't healthy for me to work for the Department of Mental Health. And then that's when I went into private practice. And have been doing my own form of what I do ever since. What I know is that regardless of how good my training was in the system, and I think it was good, and you know, I did the California number too. I started with Fritz and Carl and Virginia. And in fact, Virginia felt to me last year was the last one to go, you know, that whole crew. But what I know is I learned absolutely nothing about addictions. That I had one segment of 1 hour on my course on psychopathology of personality about alcoholism. And what that did was to give me the illusion that I knew something, which I think is very dangerous. And that I knew absolutely nothing, really, about addictions until I discovered that a member of my household was an active alcoholic. This was several years ago. I was living in a household of all women and our children. We were trying to support each other financially with child care and emotionally, et cetera, et cetera. And the place got sicker and sicker and sicker. And my way of responding to the level of illness in our household was to accept more out-of-town speaking engagements. And I think it's a very good example of how in our disease we hurt the very people we love the most, because I left my kids there in that sick house. And I've had to make amends to them for that and let go my own feeling of guilt about that. But what would happen is I would come home from out of town and waiting at the door, because I was big mama codependent of the group. I was the therapist. I knew how to keep things together. I knew how to do communications workshops. I could do communications workshops up the kazoo. I had skills. And so I would come home from an out-of-town trip, and there would be a lineup at the door. She said this, she did that, she did that. It was very difficult to tell who were the kids and who were the adults in these interactions. So with my best trained family therapy skills, having been well trained, I would get everybody in the living room, we would sit in a circle, and we would spend hours saying, now what did you say to her? And how do you feel about what she said to you? And how do you feel about how she feels about what you said to her? And we got worse. It was a real challenge to my own identity as a therapist, because no matter what I did, we got worse. And finally, with all the wisdom I could muster, I zeroed in on the lack of memory of this one person in the house, because we didn't drink much in our household. It wasn't a drinking household. So, and of course, I knew who drunks were. Drunks were people who were down on the street corner, dead drunk, laying in the gutter. But we didn't drink much, and it never occurred to me that a woman who hardly drank at all could possibly be an alcoholic. She couldn't remember anything from one thing to another. And I was always covering up for her when she forgot things, or picking up the pieces usually. And so one day I decided she must be an alcoholic because she can remember anything. And so I had just been to the bathroom, and I was coming out of the bathroom, and she was going into the bathroom. Now I figured I had the upper hand here. And knowing nothing about what an intervention was, now I would certainly do it differently, but I did my first intervention. And I looked her straight in the eye, and I said, "I think you're an alcoholic." Of course, knowing from my training that she would deny it, and then I could start beating on her. And she looked me back in the eye, and she said, "I think you're right." I had no idea what to do next. Absolutely no idea what to do next. I ran to the phone and called my friends in Minnesota, which is the incest and alcoholism capital of the world, and said, "What do I do now?" And they said, "Treatment." And I said, "Right, treatment. Where? What?" So she went to Hazelden, and then Hazelden said to us, "You're all as sick as she is." Well, I had by that time started reading because I was not about to be one-upped with this disease. And what I read was that the family is usually not cooperative in treatment and usually sabotages. Well, I wasn't going to be that way. So they said, "You're as sick as she is?" I said, "Okay." They said, "You need treatment," and I said, "Okay." They said, "You have your own disease." I said, "All right." I didn't believe it for a moment, but I was going to be cooperative. Meanwhile, I'm secretly thinking, I have been the one to keep this going, this whole household. I have been the one who went to work every day. I have been the one who was solid and clear, and all the kids knew they could depend on me. They telling me I'm sick? I don't believe it. Of course, I had been getting physically sicker. I had even had an experience where my heart had stopped, and I had an out-of-body death experience. And I began to see that the two might be related, what they were telling me and what I was again experiencing in my body. So they said, "You all need to go to treatment." So I said, "Okay." They said, "Everybody has been affected by this disease." Good. We all need to go. Right. So I got the whole household. I got my daughter, her boyfriend. I thought, surely if she's been affected, he's been affected. She was in college at the time. My son, 14. My ex-husband, because why not throw him in? I mean, if he's willing to come. My secretary. Her 2 children. Some of my clients asked if they could come, and I thought, well, why not? Surely if I've been affected, they've been affected. So we ended up with about 13 people. I never do things halfway. They say in recovery, half measures availeth nothing, and I really believe that. So no treatment center would take us. They said we were like a flying wedge, and So we had to hire the staff of a treatment center to come to us. And they were so impressed with us that the woman who did our treatment asked if she could stick her daughter in who'd never been through treatment. I said, why not? So we did treatment. And I learned a lot about alcoholism. I didn't learn a lot about mind disease because at that point, people didn't know much about mind disease. But I did learn that mind disease had a name. It was called enabler. It was called codependence at that time. And I started to go to meetings, 12-step meetings, because they said I should. Hated them. Nearly died of smoke inhalation. Clearly, it was a bunch of sick people, and I wasn't that sick. So I decided to go for scientific reasons. One of the things that I noticed is when our friend who went to treatment would get crazy, which frequently happens in early recovery. As a matter of fact, people are worse in early recovery than they were before they started recovery. I don't know whether all of you know that, but that's what happens. And so when she would get just off the wall, I found myself saying, why don't you go to a meeting? Now, I never thought that I should go to a meeting, but why don't you go to a meeting? And she'd go to a meeting, and she'd come back better. Well, I found that curious to my scientific inquiring mind. And so I started going to meetings to see why people got better. I couldn't figure it out. And I called a friend of mine who was a psychic. I know some of you may know him, Bob Leichtman. Do you know? I think has spoken at AHP in the past. He's a medical physician who has given up his medical practice to do psychic healing and psychic work. Interesting man. I thought, well, he always has an opinion on everything, and God knows he thinks he has, pipelines to all the sources of information everywhere. So I called and I said, Bob, why does this work, this 12-step program? And he said, oh, that's simple. I knew he'd say that. He always says that. It's simple. But when you have the information he does, everything seems simple. And I said, well, why? And he said, the majority of beings at these meetings aren't on this plane. He says there are a lot of people who either didn't recover and have volunteered to come back and help, or people who have recovered from their addictions and have volunteered to come back and help. So about 3/4 of the beings at the meetings are on another plane. And I said, well, that makes about as much sense as anything I've come up with, so fine. And I fought the 12-step work for about 3 years. I was pre-step 1 for 3 years. Step 1 says, I'm powerless over my addiction and my life has become unmanageable. First of all, I'm not powerless over anything. Being a feminist, I was never going to be powerless again. And my life wasn't unmanageable. It was just chaotic, but it was not unmanageable. So it needed to get more unmanageable. And what I finally realized is the first step says I'm powerless over my addiction. And I could admit that because that's the definition of an addiction, something over which we're powerless. In the meantime, I was reading everything that was written. I was going to meetings. I was talking to people. I was talking about recovery. Discovered an amazing number of people in 12-step groups that I'd never known about before. And I was trying to get a handle on this disease. I never, as I say, go at anything halfway, so I really was working with it. I went back through my practice with a fine-tooth comb and discovered that I had 3 or 4 active alcoholics in my practice that I was treating in long-term psychotherapy and had never even seen their disease. I now would probably find more. I also didn't even know about other addictions. I had some handle on the ingestive addictions of drugs, alcohol, although I was seeing a woman who was using cocaine, and we jointly decided not to bother with that and work on her long-term psychological issues. And I know I am not alone in this. I also had some people who had eating problems, but I never saw them as addiction. And I didn't even touch the process of addictions of relationship, romance, sex, work, money. I didn't know about them. And I didn't know to look at them through the prism of addiction. Now, what I learned from my own recovery from relationship addiction is that this is not a disease that you can learn about abstractly. That those people who want to understand addiction abstractly, objectively, and rationally are part of the problem. That the only way to learn about addiction is from a participatory scientific worldview. And we don't know much about that. But what I think is the paradigm of learning about addiction and recovering from addiction is offering us a way into the new paradigm that Prybram, Bohm, many people are talking about abstractly, but don't know how to do it. And what I am seeing is that the paradigm of recovery from addiction is one of the ways of leading into that paradigm, because you have to move into a participatory worldview. Now, let me just say a little bit about the worldview out of which most of us have been trained, even, I believe, in AHP. This worldview is one that's based on addiction. It is based on the very same processes that we see active in the active addict. Those are the illusion of control, the illusion of objectivity, the illusion of perfectionism, dishonesty, confusion, crazy thinking. Now, this system in which we live, I believe that there's no question but what this system functions as an active addict. It has all of the characteristics of an active addict. I used to believe that this system encouraged addictions, and I believe that's still true, but that's not enough. I then moved to a point where it was clear to me that this system demands addictions. That in order to be able to tolerate this system, you have to be addicted. That in order to tolerate the way this system operates, you have to shut off your own awareness, your own knowing, your own information system in order to be willing to tolerate yourself and what goes on around you. It is a system of denial. And what supports the denial is shutting off our own awareness, our own living process, as I call it, our own information system. Nothing does that better than addictions. The system in which we live is an illusionary system. It's based on all those illusions I just mentioned, the illusion of control, of objectivity, of perfectionism. It's based on dishonesty. We have become so accustomed to dishonesty in ourselves and other people that we feel startled when we run across someone who is really honest, that we feel that person is abrasive if they're really honest about themselves and about what they see and about what's going on. I get thousands of letters telling me how courageous I am for the books I write. It always shocks me that in a time of dishonesty, that a person who speaks the truth, as far as I know my truth, is seen as courageous. It's a beautiful, I wish I'd have brought it. There's a beautiful poem by a Russian about this. That in a time of a dishonest society, those who speak the truth are seen as courageous. And in years to come, our great-grandchildren will look back on that and think that's so amazing. Now, if we live in an illusionary system, we are told that that system is reality. And whenever we are in touch with and express our own reality as we experience it, we're told our reality is illusion. So what happens is we begin to distrust our own reality, our own experience of our reality, and we try to unlearn it and deny it in order to fit into an illusionary system. We begin to feel crazy because our own experience of reality is in conflict with what we are told reality is. And in order to shut off our own experience of craziness, we use our addictions to shut off our awareness of what's going on inside of us. When we live in a system where illusion is called reality and reality is called illusion, we always feel a little crazy. We always feel a little off base. And so we use our drugs, our chemicals, our work, our relationships to try to give us the fix, to help us be able to tolerate the system and to be able to tolerate the discrepancy with our own feeling of reality. This is what we have in the system. And then we have people like Nancy Reagan who says, just say no, showing the ultimate understanding of addiction. Or we have people who are going to have war on drugs without dealing with the systemic issues, focusing on the individual and or the family. And I have to say that those of us who work in the helping professions, I think, are contributing to the problem mightily at this point because of our insistent focus on the individual and the family and our reluctance to look at the organizations, the society, and the global problems. And I think that we need to look at the whole picture in terms of addiction and what's going on. Now, in terms of understanding addiction, as I said earlier, it's absolutely necessary to do your own recovery. I believe that there is no one in this society who is not trained into the addictive process. That we learn the addictive process in our families. We haven't even touched upon the number of people who grew up in addictive families. We're beginning to look at that. It's obvious with the number of people who are thronging to buy books like Adult Children of Alcoholics, Codependence, et cetera, that this is striking a chord at the grassroots in the individual. My perception is that the professions are trying very hard to catch up with what the individuals are already learning and already know about themselves and their own self-diagnosis. And of course, professions get their nose out of joint with self-diagnosis. But what we're seeing here, I think, is a participatory scientific worldview. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the writing of Morris Berman. I love his little book, The Reenchantment of the World. And what he says in that book, Morris is a history of philosophy and science professor. Actually, he's quit being in academia. He got nuttier, so he left. But that's his background. And what he says is that this worldview under which we have been operating is reaching its entropic state. I think most of us would agree with that if we have any awareness at all. That the worldview under which we've been operating can't make it any longer. It's gone as far as it can go. And it's like a snake eating its tail at this point. It is moving into, as my organic chemistry professor would say, entropy. I love the way he said it. So one thing I remember from that course, I don't remember, was the way he said entropy. And what is happening is that we are seeing this all over the globe. That something is happening, that this system is no longer working. It's just not working. These are not words of gloom and doom. These are words of reality. These are words that break through our denial system. It's simply not working. Now, I like what Berman says about why it isn't working. He says it's a non-participatory scientific worldview. That in this non-participatory scientific worldview, we have taken ourselves out of the action. That we have let ourselves believe in the myth of objectivity, my words. And that when you believe in the myth of objectivity, you quit participating in your world. You remove yourself from yourself, and you make the self object to be observed. Sound familiar? Analysis, endless therapy. You remove yourself and you analyze yourself. You remove yourself and you no longer participate in your own living process, in your own life. You also remove yourself from the other, and you make the other object to be observed. So you pull yourself out of what David Bohm would call the hollow movement. You remove yourself from being a participant in the universe. You remove yourself from the knowledge that you are the hologram. That you are part of the whole, and you reflect the whole, and the whole is you. You remove yourself from that information. And when you do that, you become non-participatory in your own life. And you lose track of the awareness that when that tree is cut down in the rainforest, you are being affected. And when you cut yourself off for that information, you are no longer participatory in your own life, and you are no longer participatory in your family, in your organization, in your society, on your planet, or in the universe. Our addictions are the most effective way to cut off the pain of that awareness. We have been trained in to this addictive process in every institution of our lives. Addiction is not something that just affects the coke, the crack, the alcohol addict. Addictions are something that affect all of us, and everyone in this room has been trained into the addictive process. I see the helping professions in relation to the society as the enabler is to the drunk. That the helping professions have played the role in the society of just patching things up and keeping them going enough so the society can continue to limp on as an addict. Does this make sense to you, Gianna? I believe that it is a time for those of us in the helping professions to begin to scrutinize everything that we have been taught and everything that we have been done. Everything that we have been done. Both. Because I strongly believe that we have become part of the problem while trying to alleviate the problem. And it's time for us to take a very strong look at that. I am just amazed at the unwillingness of the helping professions to look at this. I was recently on a panel with 3 people who will go unnamed, very prestigious people whom I like and admire and would love to have them like and admire me. I'm afraid that it did not end up that way. One is a Jungian analyst. One is a person who is very well known in the recovering field. And another is a person who is known in a transpersonal field of psychotherapy. We were on a panel together, and what I said was, I can no longer do what I used to do. That I have begun to see the role of therapists as I knew it as the rapist. And that I am aware of the techniques and the training that I had contributes to the problem. That I can no longer make interpretations. Now, Fritz said he didn't make interpretations, but he was just a sly old coot, and he always did. But he tried to couch them in such a way that they didn't look like interpretations. So all of us who grew up in the human potential movement have learned to say things like, well, I wonder if sometimes you don't blah, 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 blah. Or sometimes I think blah, 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 blah. Or sometimes I feel, talking about ourselves, we've learned that trick. But we're doing it purely to try to get the other person to see it the way we see it. When we do an interpretation, I believe we're raping our clients. This has been the one that has been the hardest for me to get out of the marrow of my bones, because I am very good. My interpretations are terrific. I am very intuitive, I am very present, I am very aware, and I almost always know what's going on, or my odds at guessing are very high. So people love my interpretations. Try to give up something that everybody loves and is willing to pay you for. It's hard. Let me give you an example. Last year in Germany, I was with the German training group, and I always encourage people from the American training group to go to intensives in Europe, and for the European training group to come to intensives and trainings over here, because I feel the exchange is very powerful. And people learn a lot more than what they think they're learning. And one of the women from the American training group discovered that when she was in Germany, she was almost in Israel, from her way of looking at the map. And her grandkids were in Israel. So she decided she would go to a couple intensives in Germany, and then instead of going to the training and the advanced training down in Italy, that she would fly down to Israel and spend the time with her grandchildren. One of the women in the training said, I think you ought to look at see if you're running away from something, an interpretation. Okay? So she came to me and she said, I just want to check this out with you, Anne. What do you think? Oh, an invitation to the dance, I mean. And of course I had an opinion. I have an opinion on almost everything. So I said, well, I know that when you said you weren't coming to the training and the advanced training, I felt really disappointed and sad because you're a tough old broad and you have a fantastic 12-step program, and I find that that's a really good addition to the group. I'm clean to this point. Then I said, and, see, why don't we shut up while we're ahead, right? Then I said, and when you came back and you said your daughter-in-law, you talked to your daughter-in-law and she wanted you to come and you decided to go, I said, I just felt that the decision was too fast, that you didn't give yourself time. I'm still pretty clean. That's, I'm verging on an interpretation there, but I'm still pretty clean. And then I said, and the words as they came out of my mouth felt like expanding cotton balls. They got bigger and bigger and bigger as they rolled off my tongue. And I said, and I wonder if your eagerness to go wasn't because you were so thrilled that your daughter-in-law wanted you to come. Now she said, thanks, that's real helpful. And she trotted off. And I stood there and I thought, shit. I can't do this anymore. I can't do this anymore. I feel sick. And I went and I found her and I made an amend. Part of getting healthier is when you've done something wrong faster and you can do something about it. And I said, I'm really sorry that I did that. That was out of line. I was doing your work for you. I was not trusting you. I was not respecting you, that you would come to your own knowing of whatever it is you need to know. And I'm sorry. And she said, but you were right. And I said, I don't care. I don't care. The process was one of disrespect, and I make an amend for that. Now, I find that interpretation as one of the hardest ones. I think of the techniques that most of us were taught and made up ourselves. I was great on technique evolution. That the techniques we used are analogous to the use of forceps in a normal delivery. That very often what we rip out of people with our techniques is true. And that's the seduction. That what we pull out is true. And what the person learns to trust is the technique and the therapist. They learn nothing about their own process and trusting their own process. And so we build a progressive straw house of dependency. Now, we know in the use of forceps in a normal delivery that very often the baby and the mother are injured in that process. And I believe that this is what happens with our techniques. That even though the information that we pull out is true, we are injured in the process, or the client is injured in the process. Now, we love our techniques for one reason, because they're true. What we get is true information. We also love our techniques because if we're really good at them, it keeps people coming back. We also love our techniques because we're giving people what they want, a fix. And we have been willing to give people psychological fixes because we have not believed, I believe, that if we trust their process and facilitate their process, even though it takes longer, it will be integrated into their life and they will really heal. We have not trusted that. Frequently in the 12-step program, when those of us who attempted to work other people's program for them, we're reminded that everybody has a higher power that's on duty 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and we aren't the only persons that have that really good, active, intelligent, higher power. I think we as therapists have come to believe that we are the only ones that have this information, or are privy to this information. And we have forgotten how to facilitate other people coming to their own information, even though it may differ from our insights, and learning to trust their own process in that. Now, I think the New Age, what I call the New Age pookie, is just as guilty of this as the traditional analytic, controlling psychotherapies. We have just changed the content, but we have continued to offer fixes for people and techniques for people, whether we're talking about crystals, exercises, etc., 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 whether we're talking about breath work, whether we're talking about rebirthing, whether we're talking about whatever it is, that we have been willing to use our techniques as rapists. And I think it's time that we are willing to take a look at ourselves, because I believe we are right on the cusp of a new possibility, and I see the field of addictions as opening that door, because it demands a participatory worldview and a participatory science. What I'm finding as I travel around the world is that those of us who are in the professions want to get on the bandwagon about addictions, because there's a lot of money and a lot of prestige in addictions right now, but we don't want to do our own recovery. We want to do it from a rational, logical, objective, one-up position where we're in control. And we want to use the same techniques and the same interpretations and the same approaches. We're willing to change the content, but we're not willing to change all those things we paid so much money to learn. And until we're willing to make what we do congruent with what we say, we're part of the problem. I believe we're on the edge of opportunity for a paradigm shift, and we're not going to be leading this paradigm shift or even participating in it unless we're willing to take a look at absolutely everything we have learned. And that's what my next book is about. I've had trouble writing this book because I was concerned that it would come off, and I've been accused of this by some wonderful people, sounding like I know it all, or sounding like you're doing it wrong and I'm doing it right, which I know is part of my disease. And I decided that the only way that I could write this book is that the first looks like at least 150 pages, I'm still working on it, is going to be the sharing of my own story and my own evolution as a psychotherapist and my own evolution as a recovering psychotherapist. Thank you. And the book is written as an amends to my former clients. Because what I'm saying is that this book is my amends. This book is my saying I'm sorry. For what I didn't know. This book is my saying I'm sorry for participating in a profession and a worldview that was adding to the problem when I wanted to help. This book is saying I'm sorry that I didn't know what I know now, and that my writing of it is an attempt to make an amends so I can move on and do what I know needs to be done. Thank you.
This is the end of Anne's talk. Thanks for listening. The remainder of this tape is blank.